You are sitting in a room full of people who all seem completely certain. The conversation is effortless until someone asks a question nobody expected. Not because it is offensive, not because it is impossible, simply because almost nobody has ever stopped long enough to ask it. How do we know this actually happened? The room changes, faces tighten. Some people immediately begin searching for answers they have repeated for years. Others become uncomfortable before a single piece of evidence is even discussed. That reaction is fascinating because it reveals something deeper than religion. It reveals how the human mind protects the beliefs that have become part of its identity. Most of us imagine we believe things because we carefully investigated them. In reality, we usually inherit them. We absorb them from our families, our communities, our traditions, our schools, our culture, and only afterward do we begin constructing reasons to defend what already feels true. This is not unique to Christianity. It happens in politics, history, science, culture, relationships, and even our opinions about ourselves. Familiarity often feels like evidence even when it is simply repetition. That uncomfortable reality is where today's conversation begins. Not with the goal of attacking faith, not with the goal of proving belief foolish, but with a question that deserves to be examined honestly. What kind of evidence exists for the virgin birth, and why have intelligent people reached dramatically different conclusions? Before anyone becomes defensive, notice how quickly emotion enters the conversation. That alone tells us this subject is about much more than biology or history. For billions of people, the virgin birth is not merely an ancient claim. It is connected to meaning, hope, identity, and the way they understand the life of Jesus. For others, it represents a story whose historical basis deserves scrutiny, like every other ancient account. Those two perspectives often speak past each other because they are asking different questions. One asks whether the event happened, the other asks what the event means. Sometimes those questions overlap, sometimes they do not. Imagine finding a diary written 2,000 years ago describing an extraordinary event. Your first instinct would probably not be immediate belief or immediate rejection. You would ask who wrote it, when it was written, where the information came from, whether independent sources agree, how ancient people described miraculous events, and whether similar literary patterns appear elsewhere. Historians ask these questions every day, regardless of whether the subject is religious, political, or cultural. The process itself is not hostile. It is simply how historical investigation works. When scholars examine the New Testament, one observation immediately appears. The accounts of the virgin birth are found in two Gospels, while other New Testament writings do not describe the event in the same way or do not mention it at all. Some historians argue that this silence is significant. Others argue that silence alone proves very little because ancient authors regularly selected material based on different purposes and audiences. Neither observation automatically settles the issue. Instead, it reminds us that history is rarely as simple as people wish it to be. Then another question appears. Why were extraordinary birth stories so common in the ancient world? Across multiple civilizations, remarkable leaders were sometimes described using miraculous birth narratives. To many scholars, these stories reflected the importance of the individual, rather than functioning as modern scientific reports. Others respond that superficial similarities between traditions do not demonstrate that every account served the same purpose or originated from the same cultural pattern. Once again, certainty becomes more difficult than slogans suggest. That is where psychology quietly enters the room. Human beings crave coherent stories. We naturally connect events into meaningful narratives because randomness is emotionally uncomfortable. This tendency has helped our species survive for thousands of years. Pattern recognition is one of our greatest strengths, but it can also encourage us to see certainty where only probability exists. We all do it. We remember evidence supporting our existing views more easily than evidence challenging them. Psychologists call this confirmation bias. It does not affect only religious believers. Skeptics experience it too. Every worldview carries the temptation to collect supporting evidence while quietly ignoring conflicting information. The truly difficult task is learning to recognize that tendency inside ourselves before pointing it out in someone else. Think about childhood. Most people never remember choosing their deepest assumptions. They simply remember growing up inside them. A child raised in one religious tradition often experiences its central beliefs as obvious. A child raised somewhere else may experience an entirely different tradition with equal certainty. Neither child invented those convictions independently. They inherited them long before they possessed the tools necessary to evaluate historical evidence. That realization is uncomfortable because it raises an unsettling possibility. If you had been born somewhere else, what would you believe today with complete confidence? The answer does not automatically make your present beliefs false. It simply reminds us that confidence often begins with circumstance rather than investigation. This realization should create humility, not despair. Whether someone ultimately accepts or rejects the virgin birth, the more interesting question may be how they reached that conclusion. Was it through careful examination, community influence, emotional attachment, personal experience, historical research, theological reflection, or some combination of all of them? Honest answers are rarely simple. People often imagine that changing one's mind is mainly an intellectual process. In reality, it is frequently emotional. Beliefs are connected to family dinners, childhood memories, holidays, friendships, moral frameworks, and the comforting feeling of belonging somewhere. Challenging one deeply rooted belief can feel less like correcting a historical opinion and more like risking an entire identity. That emotional cost explains why conversations about religion become heated so quickly. They are rarely just debates about evidence. They are conversations about who we are, where we belong, and whether the foundation beneath our lives feels secure. Historians continue examining ancient manuscripts. Theologians continue reflecting on meaning. Philosophers continue asking what counts as evidence for unique events. Psychologists continue studying why certainty feels so persuasive. None of these disciplines eliminates the others. Instead, they illuminate different dimensions of the same question. Perhaps the greatest mistake is assuming that difficult questions are dangerous. History repeatedly shows that sincere inquiry has often strengthened understanding, even when it has complicated easy answers. Whether someone ultimately concludes that the virgin birth is a historical miracle, a theological proclamation expressed through ancient literary forms, or remains undecided, the path toward that conclusion matters. Intellectual honesty demands curiosity before certainty. It asks us to distinguish between what history can investigate, what theology affirms, and what personal faith embraces. Those categories sometimes overlap, but they are not identical. Learning to recognize that distinction is not a threat to thinking. It is one of the foundations of mature thinking itself. If conversations like this challenge you to examine assumptions more carefully, weigh evidence more thoughtfully, and become more comfortable asking difficult questions without fearing where they lead, then this is exactly the kind of discussion worth continuing. Consider subscribing if you value conversations that explore history, psychology, philosophy, and belief with curiosity rather than certainty. The deeper you follow this question, the more you realize it is not simply about whether a miracle happened. It becomes a question about what kind of conclusions history is capable of reaching in the first place. Imagine trying to reconstruct an ordinary conversation that took place in a small village 2,000 years ago. Even with several surviving documents, there would be enormous gaps. Memories differ. Authors emphasize different details. Some information is preserved, while countless other moments disappear forever. Now imagine that the event under investigation is not ordinary at all, but one that believers understand as a unique act of God. Historians immediately face a limitation built into their discipline. Historical methods can compare sources, evaluate authorship, study language, examine cultural context, and estimate probabilities, but they cannot directly verify or falsify a supernatural event in the way a laboratory experiment can. That is why serious historians often distinguish between what can be established historically and what belongs to theological interpretation. This distinction sometimes frustrates everyone involved. Skeptics may wish for history to rule miracles impossible, while believers may wish for history to confirm them beyond doubt. Instead, historical investigation often arrives at more modest conclusions. It can tell us what early communities believed, how traditions developed, how texts were transmitted, and what competing explanations exist. It can rarely eliminate every alternative. That uncertainty is uncomfortable because human beings naturally prefer certainty. We often mistake confidence for knowledge because confidence feels emotionally satisfying. Yet history repeatedly reminds us that sincere people have defended incorrect conclusions with complete conviction. Confidence alone has never been reliable evidence. At the same time, uncertainty should not automatically be mistaken for falsehood. A lack of definitive historical proof is not the same as proof that something never occurred. These are different claims requiring different standards of reasoning. This is where many public debates become confused. Participants unknowingly shift from discussing evidence to making philosophical assumptions about what kinds of events are even possible. Someone who begins with the assumption that miracles cannot occur will interpret extraordinary claims differently from someone who believes that miracles are possible in principle. Both individuals may examine the same documents while reaching different conclusions because they are operating from different starting points. Recognizing those starting points does not settle the debate, but it makes the disagreement easier to understand. It also encourages intellectual honesty, because every worldview contains assumptions that cannot themselves be proven entirely from historical documents. Another fascinating aspect is how stories acquire meaning within communities. Long before modern publishing, ancient traditions were preserved through repeated telling, public reading, and shared memory. Communities did not simply store information, they interpreted it. They connected events to older scriptures, symbols, and expectations. Whether one approaches the gospel narratives primarily as historical testimony, theological proclamation, or a combination of both, it is difficult to deny that they were written to communicate meaning as well as events. Ancient biographies were not identical to modern journalism. Their authors often arranged material to emphasize themes, fulfill literary purposes, and help readers understand the significance of a person's life. Recognizing this literary dimension does not automatically weaken historical value. It simply reminds us that ancient writing followed different conventions from those many people assume today. Consider how people remember important moments in their own lives. Two siblings can describe the same childhood with remarkable sincerity while emphasizing entirely different details. Neither necessarily intends deception. Memory naturally selects what seems meaningful. Now extend that observation across decades of oral transmission in an ancient society where storytelling served as a primary way of preserving identity. Scholars continue debating exactly how these traditions developed, but nearly everyone agrees that understanding ancient communication requires resisting the temptation to impose modern expectations on every ancient text. Psychology offers another layer. Human beings are storytellers by nature. We construct narratives that help us organize reality, explain suffering, celebrate hope, and understand ourselves. Stories are not automatically false because they carry meaning, nor are they automatically factual because they inspire people. Their emotional power and their historical status are related questions, but they are not identical. One reason discussions about religion become so emotionally charged is that people often fear one of two extremes. Some worry that if every detail cannot be historically demonstrated, then everything collapses. Others assume that if a story contains symbolism or theological purpose, then it must have no historical foundation at all. Real scholarship usually occupies a far more complex middle ground, where evidence is weighed carefully and uncertainty is acknowledged rather than hidden. Living with uncertainty is one of the hardest psychological tasks we face. We prefer clean answers because they reduce anxiety. Yet many of life's most important questions remain partially open despite centuries of reflection. That does not mean investigation is pointless. On the contrary, it means intellectual maturity often consists of learning how to think carefully without demanding absolute certainty where it cannot honestly be claimed. This principle applies far beyond religion. It shapes the way we understand history, relationships, politics, and even our own memories. Every generation inherits stories, Some are confirmed by further evidence, some are revised, some remain debated. The challenge is not merely deciding what to believe, but learning how to evaluate competing claims with humility. That humility does not require abandoning conviction. It requires recognizing the difference between confidence rooted in careful reasoning and confidence rooted only in familiarity. If today's discussion has revealed anything, it is that difficult questions deserve patience rather than fear. They invite us to slow down, examine assumptions, distinguish between historical investigation and theological affirmation, and become more aware of the psychological forces that shape every human mind. Whether you ultimately regard the virgin birth as a historical miracle, a central confession of Christian faith, a literary expression of theological truth, or an unresolved historical question, the quality of your reasoning matters. Independent thought is not measured by arriving at a fashionable conclusion. It is measured by the willingness to follow evidence, acknowledge limits, question your own assumptions, and treat disagreement as an opportunity to understand rather than merely to win. If conversations like these encourage you to think more carefully, read more deeply, and become more comfortable with questions that resist easy answers, then you are already practicing one of the most valuable habits any thoughtful person can develop. Eventually, every discussion like this stops being about ancient texts and starts becoming about the person reading them. That is the moment many people never expect. We begin by asking whether an event happened 2,000 years ago, but we end by discovering how our own minds respond when deeply held assumptions are examined. Some people feel relief when uncertainty appears because it gives them permission to rethink ideas they accepted without question. Others feel anxiety because uncertainty can seem like the first crack in a foundation they have trusted their entire lives. Neither reaction is surprising. Human beings are not purely logical creatures. We are emotional, relational, and deeply influenced by the communities that shape us. Our beliefs often become intertwined with our memories, our families, our moral instincts, and our sense of belonging. That is why conversations about religion rarely remain abstract. They touch questions of identity, purpose, hope, grief, justice, and mortality. The deeper the belief, the greater the emotional weight attached to it. Recognizing this should make us more patient with one another rather than more dismissive. It is easy to assume that people who disagree with us simply have not examined the evidence. Reality is usually more complicated. Intelligent, sincere, and well-informed individuals often evaluate the same sources differently because they assign different weight to historical probabilities, philosophical assumptions, personal experience, and theological commitments. That does not mean every conclusion is equally persuasive, but it does remind us that disagreement is not by itself evidence of bad faith. One of the most valuable habits in any difficult conversation is learning to ask not only what someone believes, but why they find that conclusion convincing. Sometimes the answer lies in historical arguments. Sometimes it lies in a transformative personal experience. Sometimes it is rooted in years of study. Sometimes it reflects a lifelong tradition that has never been questioned. Understanding those differences does not require abandoning your own convictions. It requires recognizing that belief is rarely formed by evidence alone. This insight reaches far beyond religion. Think about how often people defend political positions, cultural assumptions, or personal opinions with complete confidence, only to discover later that their certainty rested more on social reinforcement than careful examination. The same psychological tendencies that influence religious belief also influence nearly every area of human life. We naturally seek information that confirms what we already think. We notice evidence that supports our existing framework more easily than evidence that challenges it. We often interpret ambiguous facts in ways that fit the stories we already tell ourselves. Becoming aware of these tendencies is not a cure for bias, but it is an important first step toward thinking more clearly. If there is one lesson worth carrying away from this discussion, it is that intellectual humility is not the enemy of conviction. It is the discipline that prevents conviction from becoming arrogance. Humility allows us to distinguish between what we know with confidence, what we infer from evidence, what remains uncertain, and what ultimately belongs to faith or philosophical commitment. Those distinctions matter because they help us avoid overstating our case, regardless of which position we hold. The question of the virgin birth has been discussed for centuries by historians, biblical scholars, philosophers, and theologians, and there is no indication that the conversation will end soon. Some scholars argue that the earliest Christian traditions should be read primarily through the lens of theological proclamation. Others maintain that the Gospel writers intended to communicate extraordinary historical events as well as theological meaning. Many recognize elements of both history and theology operating together. These debates continue not because evidence is ignored, but because interpreting ancient evidence requires judgment, and reasonable people sometimes exercise that judgment differently. What should concern us most is not whether every difficult question has an immediate answer, but whether we are willing to ask those questions honestly. Honest inquiry is not an act of disrespect. It is an acknowledgement that truth deserves careful attention rather than easy slogans. At the same time, thoughtful skepticism should avoid becoming cynicism. Rejecting every extraordinary claim simply because it is extraordinary is no more intellectually satisfying than accepting every extraordinary claim without examination. Both approaches replace investigation with assumption. The challenge is to remain open enough to follow evidence wherever it reasonably leads, while also recognizing the limits of historical methods and the role that philosophical and theological commitments inevitably play. Perhaps the most uncomfortable realization is that certainty itself can become emotionally addictive. It feels safe, it feels stable, it feels like protection against doubt. Yet history repeatedly demonstrates that progress in knowledge often begins when someone becomes willing to admit that an old question deserves another look. That willingness does not guarantee a different conclusion. Sometimes careful investigation strengthens existing beliefs. Sometimes it revises them. Sometimes it simply reveals that reality is more complex than either side initially imagined. Complexity should not discourage us. It should remind us that the pursuit of understanding is a lifelong process rather than a destination. In the end, each person must decide how to integrate historical evidence, philosophical reasoning, personal experience, and faith commitments into a coherent worldview. No documentary, book, lecture, or conversation can make that decision for you. What it can do is encourage a habit that is increasingly rare: the courage to think carefully before reacting, to question assumptions without fearing the outcome, and to recognize that sincere dialogue is often more valuable than winning an argument. Whether you finish this discussion with the same beliefs you began with, or with new questions you had never considered before, the most important outcome is not agreement with a particular conclusion. It is the development of a mind that values honesty over comfort, curiosity over complacency, and careful reasoning over reflexive certainty. Conversations like this are ultimately less about reaching the final word on an ancient debate than about becoming the kind of person who is willing to examine difficult questions with integrity. If that kind of thoughtful exploration is the kind of conversation you want more of, then stay with this channel as we continue examining history, psychology, philosophy, and belief with a commitment to evidence, nuance, and intellectual honesty.